What if I told you that over half of us will face unbearable loss without the tools to heal? That we'll numb ourselves, throw ourselves into work, and wonder why we can't feel joy anymore? Today, we're sitting down with someone who's walked through the darkest valleys of grief and found a way back to light. This is a conversation that could change how you handle the hardest moments of your life.
Now available. Awakening I Am, Internal Awareness in an AI Age audiobook, and our Victory Builders platform, which integrated system for founders who execute, is open. Links in the description. Throughout my career, I've had to do a lot of funeral services. When I first started doing preaching ministry, I I was reading that you had to have at least 1,000 hours of time in order to get better at something. So I lent my services for free to a funeral home in the community,
Oh, that's amazing.
and I began to preach. But I was being helpful, but I was just really preaching to get my 1,000 hours to get better. So I would actually preach as if it was like Sunday morning. It helped me get better, but it also helped me to understand grief at its highest points.
I imagine.
And even today, some 26 years later, we're still helping families through. But the thing that we've never really established is a pattern of things in order to give a person to say, hey, if you do this, if you do that, steps, systems. And that's necessary. Having not just compassion and saying the right words or singing the right song in its proper context. But once everyone gets in the car and everyone goes their separate ways, their families are usually left behind to pull the things together. And for high end executives and people who are always in leading or in the forefront, they you just don't have the time sometimes. And we can grieve without knowing that we're grieving. And that's the scary part, when everything just hits you at once. And it can be some years later, it can be months later, it can be immediate. There's no formula about how grief comes. However, there can be a formula about how we handle it. My name is NaRon Tillman. This is Walk in Victory, where we sit you at the feet of the masters and we have conversations to help you evolve your lives. These conversations are intentional, um, to help transform mindset, create new, what we call neural pathways. And these neural pathways is new ways of thinking as we continue our walk. And today's master is Miss Sylvia. How are you?
NaRon, thank you so much for having me. I'm very well, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation today.
Thank you for joining us. So when we hear the word grief, and me understanding that vocabulary or language is the only science that can evolve and be expansive, what do we what do people ascertain when they hear that word from the point where you sit?
Yeah, so grief is a very scary word, really, and there has been a lot of research done, scientific research over the last few years, and particularly by one woman called Mary Frances O'Connor, and she has studied the brain in grief and the body, and she's done many CT scans on grieving brains. And she explains that there is a difference between grief and grieving. And grief is that weight of unbearable pain that hits you when it hits you. And at the beginning, when you've just lost a loved one, it is constant. But grieving is the process of integrating grief and of learning to live with it. So these are two different things. And although there is science applied to these things, grief is a very personal and individual experience. And it's quite strange because grief is universal. Everyone will be experiencing grief at some point in some form or shape, but the experience of it is very individual, and it also feels very, very lonely.
Let's unpack the because grieving is the continuation from just looking at the suffix of the word. Is that what usually happens, like the continuation of grief?
Yes, so grief is really an experience that lasts for a very long time. It's extremely shocking. And I always compare grief to a wound. And if you hurt yourself physically, you have a wound. And some wounds will heal on their own over time. That's just the magic of our physiology, of our body. Some wounds will heal over time on their own, and some wounds will not heal on their own. And the problem with a wound that doesn't heal is that they never remain the way they are. They get worse, they fester. And it's the same for grief. So again, there have been studies conducted on the resiliency that people might have in regards to grief. And very surprisingly, for the scientists leading that research, that study, over 50%, not much more, but like 51 or 52% of people in the study were actually resilient, and they would manage through grief without worrying complications, which doesn't mean they weren't suffering. It was still a very hard process, but they did manage to integrate it and to learn to live with it. So this is something that can come quite as a surprise. We're more resilient than we think.
When a person has a traumatic experience in their physical body, and it changes the way that they process in the mental, is studies have shown that the faster we attack it, the easier it is to go back to what we would consider normal, because we just tapping back into that first pattern of thought, that first pathway. And the longer we wait to attack it, the longer the process. And I believe that minutes turn into years, not minutes for hours of rehab and recovery, because we have created a new pathway, and that new pathway is settled in. And the longer it settles in, the harder it is to rewire or transform it. Especially if we don't do the deep mental work. Can that be said also for grief?
Yes, yes, yes. And I like to use that analogy with a wound, because if there are any listeners out there who are grieving and who are wondering, well, how do I know if I should seek support, or if I'm among these resilient people who will just manage, to go through? Well, it's really like a wound. If you find that it slowly gets better over time, and by that I mean, if you find yourself smiling a little bit more often, find joy in little moments of daily lives, if you find that you're feeling better or better more often over time, then it means your wound is healing. But if you feel no difference, and if it actually even sometimes feels like it's getting worse, then it's really important to tend to it, because like you say, if it is not being taken care of, it will only get worse.
For let's Before we get into the steps, how should one who has a family member that they know that is grieving, or someone in their circle, like you're an executive and one of your employees lose their children, just as an example, or a mom, how do we as a community go about fostering compassion, and what are some of the things that we should not say or do?
Well, I think the first thing not to do is to avoid the situation and the person. And this is unfortunately what happens a lot. And it's not by lack of care. It's really that people are genuinely lost for words, and they are so worried they might make it worse by saying the wrong thing that they'd rather not say anything. But that's actually the hardest. So whatever the situation, just dare to approach the person and talk. Don't give advice. Don't compare to your own experience, and don't say things like, oh, at least they're in a better place now, or they had a good life. Like, don't try to find silver linings. So these would be the things to avoid, really, if possible. And then to just ask, is there anything I can do to be helpful? Or especially if it's in the corporate world, to really take initiative and say, would it be helpful if I took over that meeting for you today? Or would you like me to, I don't know, take part of your project, so really like initiating some help with intention and talking about the person. People who grieve, they love to be asked about their person, and if they don't, they'd rather say, oh, listen, I don't want to talk about it today. But it's always better to be asked. When I had my first experiences of grief, I was a child first and then a teenager, and as a teenager, our emotions are very heightened. And sometimes I felt so lonely, so many times in my grief. And sometimes I would just wanted someone to ask me so that I could, be angry at least a little bit and say, oh, leave me alone, because this alone would have helped me a little bit, just to give me the opportunity to say something. But it is scary, and it's really about, for the people who are around the grievers, just remember to try to not make it about you, about your discomfort. Just try to step over your own discomfort and come from a place of compassion and kindness and generosity, and just take the discomfort and maybe even, a harsh reply if that's what's going to happen.
So when we I know me growing up in a religious context, we have all of these little catchphrases that I found over the course of my dealing with families that are not really, really good things to say, like God knows best, or he doesn't make mistakes. And we think that we're saying something that's going to help them out, and it really makes them more angry. How how thin is the line between grief and anger?
Well, anger is a very interesting emotion because, anger is not really an emotion as such. Anger is always the expression of another emotion. And so when anger appears, it's always important to welcome her and to ask, what are you here to represent? Is it fear?
Mm.
Is it doubt? Is it frustration? Is it anxiety? Like, what is anger here for? But in terms of emotions in general, there's like a plethora of emotions coming up in grief, and it's important to welcome them all. And I think that is valid for life in general. Emotions are here to either teach us something or inform us about something. So they're all valid and they're all welcome, even the ones we wish we didn't have, even the ones that maybe might make us feel ashamed or are really uncomfortable. We don't want to admit that we have these emotions. It doesn't matter. They're all welcome. What we are responsible for are our actions, but not our emotions. So our emotions should be welcomed and just be listened to, witnessed, and then just let them go again. But anger is one of these, and anger is also a very powerful energy. And I think when we do the work, there is a time, again, we don't want to push that anger away, but there is a time where, as we recalibrate, as we process, we can use that incredible energy towards something else, towards something that might be of service to ourselves or to others.
In my observation, I've noticed that people, when they grieve and they start relationships, not new friendships, but relationships, they find someone and they're bringing the portion of them that is grieving. Usually, when they come out of that space, that mental fog or whatever it is, there's friction in the relationship because the person is saying, "Oh, you've changed." And I often tell people just be careful about tying into commitments when you're feeling down, because this may, like, our personality when we're grieving is not going to be the personality if when we come out of the grief, and then it's going to look like we've changed, and it's really not. You just met me when I was in the fog. Is that observation a true one? Or
Yeah, that is a very complex one. So I am sadly familiar with family losses. I lost my dad as a child, my younger brother as a teenager, and then later in life, my older brother and my mum. So I work more with family constellations, but it is true that grief really changes you radically, or it brings out something different of you, and it like opens a portal to another dimension where suddenly things have different types of, it recalibrates. You find yourself enjoying certain things that you didn't enjoy before. You just pay more attention to what is really important to you. And you feel a pain that you didn't know existed when you feel grief. But then on the other side of this, you also feel joys and love and intensity of emotions that you didn't know existed either. And I found that from my personal experience and the people I've worked with, the main change, in going from really grieving intensely into coming out of the other side is that we just don't take bath anymore. It's like some things are very important, some things are tragedies, and many things are inconveniences. And I find that the tolerance for people who just can't get over inconveniences lessens when you've experienced grief. And that can impact relationships.
Yes, yeah, because now there's new frictions and things that why before you like this and before you did, but I didn't even realize the just the deeper yearning that a person gets for life or for taking chances in areas that they may have not taken chances before, or I never really would have put that into context. Let's look at, and I know you work with families, but there's these tools that you have can work with anyone. So a lot of our audience are like people who are either entrepreneurs or thinking about entrepreneurship, thought leaders, and such, and men, a lot of men who I'm thinking don't deal with grief because we've turned off the portal of our emotion. We deal with it, but sometimes we can deal with it in an unhealthy way. What are some of the things that you would say to a man that all right, I'm gonna just go back to work. All right, I got a business to run, and never really sit with that emotion that is a real and true emotion.
Yes, that can be a really big part of that process, that is that numbness, like we kind of numb and we just keep doing what we have to do, and we kind of throw ourselves into work and responsibilities. And it is often seen in the bigger picture as a wrong thing, like this is not the right thing to do. But sometimes it's a matter of survival, and this is what's going to save you for a time being, to just be occupied, distract yourself with work, just throw yourself at other things. But for the people you mentioned, for your audience, which are also the kind of people I work with, people who have no other choice but to show up, who have responsibilities, life just keeps going. And that can be entrepreneurs, that can be moms, that can be carers. There are many populations who just cannot afford to take 6 months off because it's just impossible. And so what I would, and they seem normal, like to the outside world, they are functioning because they do what needs to be done. But inside, they're on edge, they're tense, and they can just feel that something is off. But it is a bit scary to face. So what I would start by doing is to be super pragmatic for very pragmatic people, because that's often the best way to approach it. And it's to tend to the body before tending to the emotions. So you don't want to face your emotions. You're a bit scared of that right now. Okay, we'll do it later. But for now, start to tend to your body. So eat well, hydrate, try to have a good sleep routine, get some daylight in the morning, get some movement, and surround yourself with people who give you energy, and try to avoid those who drain your energy. And sometimes, when we're grieving, the roles can be reversed, and the people of which we think they should be the ones giving us energy, they're actually the ones draining us. And it has nothing to do with love. We might love them a lot, and then sometimes people who might have seemed almost insignificant in your life, they suddenly bring you such a warmth and a well-being when you're around them. So just follow that. But that's the first thing I would say to these high performers, is to tend to your body. And then at some point, you're going to have to start to face your emotions. And the best way to do that, again, because facing them is scary, is to observe them. Just learn to see them and try to develop a vocabulary around these emotions. Not just I'm sad, I'm happy, I'm angry, I'm tired, but try to be really specific. So there are many apps or the Wheel of Emotions that you can have on your fridge, and just try to develop a wider range of vocabulary, because the more precise you will be in naming, labeling your emotions, the better you will understand them and also understand other people who might feel them. So these would be the first two steps. Tend to your body and learn to see your emotions without judging them.
That's that's really, 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 really great, because in our culture there's a disconnect between the mind and the emotion and the body, where they they are unified, they are one. The
Completely.
mind and the body are interconnected, and we store our stories in our bodies.
Yes.
So movement can help alleviate a lot of
Big time.
emotion, big time, but we don't really see the correlation. So besides movement and all the other things that you discuss, what are some of the little systems the eating is important, yes, because what we put in our bodies, and the sleep is important because some people just can't find rest, but the movement and eating the proper foods will help your body find rest. How important is it to stay away from things that we may grow addicted to, like over drinking or partying and all of those things that will bring us into a deeper state of emotion?
And this is a really tricky one, because grief is very brutal, and sometimes this is a go-to, to numb and to help us go through. And it's always a fine line. You don't want to be preaching the super healthy lifestyle and tell people, don't do this, don't grab the glass of wine in the evening, don't. But then you also want to be understanding that sometimes it's a matter of survival, and even if they are not the ideal coping mechanisms, they will be the one to get us through a few weeks. But again, it's a fine line. So I think it's really important to monitor yourself, or to ask someone to help you monitor, like someone really, your best friend, someone really close, a sibling, someone you really don't shy away from. And then to do these practices for the body, that's super, super important. And you were talking about the link between the mind and the body. I think we are far away from understanding the wisdom of our bodies. And we have such an amazing pool of features in our body that we can tap into to help our overall well-being, starting with the fact that, I just want to go back to this because I think it's important. Grief is experienced as a threat by the body. So we are in a heightened alert when we are grieving, because the people we love are part of our physiological and emotional ecosystem. And when they leave, it is extremely disturbing and shocking for the whole system. And so by using movement mindfully, by moving slowly, or by just lying down in certain positions, we are using the body to signal our brain safety. So if you use the simple classic shavasana after a yoga class, you sit there with your palms towards the ceiling, your feet rolling outwards, just lying there. Well, this is actually so much more than we think. We're not just there relaxing. This is a position that for our hunter-gatherer buddies from 200,000 years ago is very vulnerable. We expose our throat and our chest, we expose our hips, we expose all these very delicate organs. So if we place our body in this position that is vulnerable and stay relaxed there, breathe there, we tell the brain, I am safe, I am safe. But we tell the brain without really making any other effort, just being in a position. And the safer the brain will feel, the less there will be tendency towards addictions.
I teach mindfulness and yoga movements and such. And one of the big things that I'm a huge advocate for now, and wasn't earlier, but now, is how do we speak to ourselves in the subconscious. And if someone came to me and they would say words like constantly say, I am grieving, I would allow them to express themselves, but I would also try to replace that mindset. instead of I am grieving, I'm experiencing grief. Because if we attach that adjective, I am grieving, the subconscious doesn't really know how to,
It's all right.
to distinguish between the two. And then you will be, because I am is such a powerful word, and whatever we attach to it takes over the brain.
Yes.
And the brain is going to give you what it is that you're asking for.
Exactly. And that just shows this is very powerful what you're saying. And it's so true. And it shows again the agency we have and the power we have to help ourselves with little intentional practices that are really accessible to anyone. You know, you don't need to have a degree for that. You don't need money for that. We can all do these little things that will really, over time, with the compound effect, make a tremendous difference.
Yeah. So what is your, how did you get into this field of expertise, and how are you showing up for people now and using, well, we've heard the backstory, and you've personally experienced it, but how did you take your personal experiences and make excuses, but now you made a
Yes. So the thing that happened was that I had lost my dad as a child, my younger brother as a teenager, both suddenly, quite brutally. And I spent decades just bracing for the next wave of grief. I was completely at the mercy of grief. I was just a victim. Like I stopped doing things like going to the movies, reading novels, going to cafes, because I was just scared I would be triggered by a random wave of grief. And so I spent years like that thinking, well, this is just how life is. I had capitulated, thinking this is what life is like when you lose the people you love most. And then fast forward a few decades, my older brother died in a car crash. And that's when I really got very angry at grief, because I felt like I had lost such precious time that I could have been mindfully spending with him to unattended grief. And so that was the beginning of me really diving into the research, trying to understand, also to make sense of the world, because lockdown happened shortly after and my whole life seemed to crumble. The world seemed to collapse, and science was giving me some kind of structure and hold. And then I did therapy as well. And one day my therapist said to me, you know, this is not my place to say that, but you have experienced grief more than average and you have, you know, found ways to deal with it. I think you should share that. You should make that your work of your line of work. And my first reaction was absolutely not. No, thank you. I've had enough grief in my life. I don't want to have other people's grief. I don't want that. No, thank you. And I walked home that day, and as the magic of walking outdoors happens, 20 minutes later, by the time I got home, I thought, she's right. She's right. Because she said to me, she said, you know, I shouldn't be saying that, but you clearly have a mission and you are not allowed to ignore it. She said, you're looking after yourself now, that's really good, but you owe it to others to give them hope and to show them a way. And that really resonated. And that's how I started to dedicate my work really to grief. And before that, I was already doing Pilates and mindfulness and life coaching. So it kind of naturally merged towards just doing the same things, but specifically for grief.
my last question, and then I'll get you out of this. Has been a beautiful conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your story, being vulnerable, and giving us some tips that we could use. I grew up in New York City, which in what they call a housing facility, but they used to call the projects. And it's high rise buildings, low income, high crime, and we lost a lot of people. And sometimes we become numb to fighting or numb to grief or numb to certain things. And then when youth or young adults lose someone that's close to them, they can't they can't function, right? Because they've numbed themselves to violence, but yet if grandma something happened to grandma, they fall
Mm.
apart. If something happens to somebody that's close, when someone grows up in a low income, high violent area, what are some of the things that we should be looking for, or what are some of the things that we should kind of tell them? I know you don't have all the answers, but how would you approach someone in that type of
Situation, yeah.
situation.
Well, I would say to narrow it down, if there was just one thing to open them up to be helpful, it's what I mentioned earlier, teach them to see their emotions. That would be the first step. And even if the emotion is numbness, indifference, these type
Mhm.
of things, but to learn to understand, not to understand, but to label their emotions, because this just unlocks things in the brain. And when we name them, when we see them, then we can start to tend to them. But yeah, that's something that I recommend to do with anyone young, with the younger generations, teenagers, young adults, even children. If Give them words to express how they feel, and that's the starting point towards something better.
How do you feel about after they've named their emotion and identified them, helping them to rename them or to re to and like for one of the things that I do is like for every time I do this drill and then we'll end
Yeah,
on this
yeah.
and you can help I say I do this drill where I tell people to sit with your thoughts, but observe your thoughts passively. Just don't breathe, don't listen to anything else. Just listen to the thoughts that are flying through our mind. And as a third party observer, start to notice the pattern of your thoughts. Are they more positive or are they more negative? And we sit for a minute and a half to 2 minutes. And then, the monkey mind
Yeah,
starts to
yeah, yeah.
go. And then I say, okay, now be honest and take an assessment of your thoughts. If your thoughts were more negative than positive, let's isolate the negative thoughts. And for every negative thought that you had, let's take and hardwire within the same context. So if the negative thought was around finances, let's hardwire two positive thoughts. So every time the negative thought come up, you now install two positive thoughts. So if it's I'm broke, you say I'm grateful for what I have. I'm grateful for my apartment. I'm grateful for the food. Whatever it is that, but it's in the same context. And wrestle with that, but I let them wrestle with that longer because it's hard sometimes when you're in the beach to enjoy the water.
Yeah.
And for those who have positive thoughts, naturally, if everything is now take those positive thoughts and add gratitude to it. So we're kind of rewiring the brain. Can that also work in areas of grief?
Yeah, that's a beautiful, beautiful drill you just shared here. Yeah, absolutely. And this is one thing that I recommend as well is for people to journal, because grief seems overpowering and you really feel like you're just suffering. But we're not just suffering. There are always moments during the day where suffering lessens, or the edges soften a bit. So I recommend to write it down, to be like, okay, when was grief very
Mm.
present today? But when was it a bit softer? Was there a moment holding your warm cup of coffee, looking outside, seeing the kids play, and then just journal them and see if over time there is a pattern that maybe these moments are a bit more frequent. But the one you're doing, just observing the thoughts without judgment, it's so much harder than we think, because we have so many shoulds and shouldn'ts, and that is already a beautiful first step. And then to implement, to ingrain another thought that counters that, that's wonderful. That's super helpful. Yeah.
Well, there you have it, everyone. Listen, all of Sylvia's information is in the description. We have had a great conversation, and this conversation is universal because there will be a point in time where all of us will have suffered a loss and would have to have some kind of tool in our bag to lean into. So you got some great things to work with through journaling, through thinking, through movement. And if you're working with a family or you have a loved one that is going through, try to get them to do some of these things that you heard today, or if you're doing it personally. And if you don't have the capacity to do so, follow our guest. And there's always tips, drills, and things as such that you can start to implement today. We don't ask you for likes. I mean, we don't ask you for Venmos, Cash Apps, or any of those things. Those things are helpful, but what we do ask is that you follow our guests and that you support them because they are the lifeline of what we do, and that you hit like, share, and subscribe because your likes, your shares, your subscriptions will help us get these conversations into the ears of the people that need it most. There's somebody in your community that need to hear this conversation. Enjoy the rest of your day. Don't walk with your head down. Don't walk making excuses. Together we walk in victory. And Sylvia, who's the same namesake as my mom, is now a part of the Walk in Victory family. Peace.